Margaret Reynolds was known as the best piano teacher in town. For over 30 years, she taught hundreds of children to play music, guiding them with patience and care. Everyone knew her as Miss Maggie, the kind lady who loved music and never missed a lesson. She lived alone in a quiet neighborhood, her days filled with the soft sounds of piano keys as students came in and out of her house. But on a cold November morning, everything changed. Maggie's house, once filled with music, fell silent. Her student, Emma Taylor, arrived for her usual lesson only to find the door unlocked and the house eerily quiet. Inside, she discovered something no child should ever see: her beloved teacher, lifeless at the piano, her final lesson abruptly cut short. The town was in shock. Who could have done this to Miss Maggie, the gentle piano teacher who never had a bad word to say about anyone? At first, there seemed to be no clues, no sign of a break-in, and no one had seen anything unusual. But as detectives began to dig deeper, secrets long buried started to come to light. Detective Sarah Mitchell, known for her sharp instincts, was called in to investigate. What she would uncover was more than anyone had imagined. Miss Maggie had secrets of her own, and not everyone in her life was who they seemed to be. What started as a tragic and mysterious death would soon unravel into a complicated web of hidden relationships, lies, and a shocking motive that no one saw coming. Stay with us as we walk through the events of that fateful day and the twists and turns that led to the truth behind the piano teacher's last lesson. Margaret Maggie Reynolds lived a life that most people would describe as peaceful. At 62, she had dedicated her life to teaching music, specifically the piano, in a small town where everyone knew each other. Over the years, she had taught hundreds of children to play, and many of her students stayed in touch, fondly remembering their lessons with her. Her house, located at the end of a quiet street, was filled with the sound of music nearly every day, with students coming and going. Maggie's appearance fit the image of a gentle teacher. With silver gray hair always neatly styled in a short bob and a warm smile for everyone, she was someone people trusted. She lived alone in the modest home she had inherited from her parents years ago. The house was cozy, with an old grand piano in the corner of the living room, a large bookshelf full of music sheets, and a few framed photos of her former students and family. But for all her kindness, Maggie was a private person. She didn't socialize much outside of her lessons and was rarely seen at community events. Neighbors would wave at her when she walked to the market or tended to her small flower garden, but Maggie never stayed to chat. This private nature didn't strike anyone as odd. People assumed she was simply someone who enjoyed her quiet life. One of Maggie's regular students was Emma Taylor, a 16-year-old girl who had been taking lessons with Maggie for the past 4 years. Emma was talented and hardworking, and Maggie was proud of her progress. The Taylors, Emma's parents, often commented on how much their daughter had learned from Maggie. Emma's father, Robert, would drive her to Maggie's house every Saturday morning, waiting in the car while his daughter had her lesson. On November 15th, things took a dark turn. It was a Saturday like any other, or so it seemed. Emma arrived for her usual piano lesson around 10 a.m., but when she knocked on Maggie's door, there was no answer. The door was slightly ajar, which Emma thought was strange. She pushed the door open, calling out for Maggie as she stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. Emma made her way to the living room, where the piano was. What she found there would haunt her forever. Maggie was sitting slumped over the piano, her face hidden behind the music sheets, and there was something terribly wrong. Her usual warm presence was gone, replaced by a chilling silence. Emma didn't need to look closely to know that her beloved teacher was no longer alive. Panicked, she ran out of the house and straight to her father, who was waiting in the car. Robert rushed inside, and as soon as he saw Maggie, he called the police. The small town's police department quickly arrived on the scene, led by Detective Sarah Mitchell, a 38-year-old investigator known for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense attitude. From the moment she stepped into Maggie's living room, she knew this was no ordinary death. Maggie's posture, the way she was slumped over, and the marks on her neck all pointed to foul play. The quiet neighborhood, usually undisturbed, quickly became the center of attention. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering about what could have happened. Betty Carter, Maggie's next-door neighbor and friend, was particularly shaken. She had seen Maggie the day before, and everything had seemed perfectly normal. Betty had brought over some cookies, and Maggie had been her usual friendly self, thanking Betty and promising to stop by for tea soon. Betty never imagined that this would be the last time she'd see her friend alive. The news of Maggie's death spread quickly through the town. People were in shock. Who would want to harm the sweet piano teacher? Maggie had no known enemies, no signs of trouble in her life. The town's small police department, led by Detective Mitchell, began their investigation. They knew that in a town this size, someone had to know something. But as they dug deeper into Maggie's life, they realized there was more to the story than anyone could have guessed. Detective Mitchell started her investigation by speaking with the people closest to Maggie. The first person she questioned was Robert Taylor, the man who had found Maggie after his daughter, Emma, ran out of the house in shock. Robert described the scene to Mitchell: how the door had been left open, how quiet the house had been, and how Maggie had looked when he found her. He was visibly shaken as he recounted the details, still processing what he had witnessed. But Mitchell knew Robert wasn't a suspect. He had been waiting in the car the whole time, as confirmed by his daughter and by a neighbor who had seen them arrive. Next, Mitchell turned her attention to Emma. The teenage girl was still in shock from finding her teacher's body. She told the detective everything she could remember about that day, how she had knocked, how the door had been open, and how strange it was that Maggie hadn't greeted her like she always did. But beyond that, Emma had no idea what could have happened to Maggie. She spoke fondly of her teacher, saying that Maggie had been like a grandmother to her. There was no reason to believe that Emma or her family had any motive to harm Maggie. But as Mitchell continued her investigation, she began to realize that Maggie had secrets that no one in the town knew about. The first clue came when Mitchell spoke with Betty Carter, the elderly neighbor who had known Maggie for over 20 years. Betty mentioned that although Maggie had always been friendly, she had always kept her personal life private. Betty didn't know much about Maggie's past, except that she had moved to the town after her parents passed away, and that she never spoke of any family members or friends from her younger years. Curious, Mitchell decided to look into Maggie's past, hoping to find some clue as to who might have had a motive to hurt her. What she found surprised her. Maggie hadn't always been a piano teacher. In fact, she had once lived a very different life in a city far from the quiet town where she had settled. Before moving to the small town, Maggie had been involved in a bitter legal dispute over her parents' estate with a distant relative. The case had been messy, with accusations of theft and betrayal on both sides. Eventually, Maggie had won the case, inheriting everything, while the relative had walked away with nothing. Mitchell now had a lead. Could this relative have held a grudge against Maggie for all these years? It seemed possible, especially since Maggie had cut off contact with everyone from her old life after the legal battle. But tracking down this relative proved difficult. Maggie had done a good job of erasing her past, and there were few records of her family beyond the court case. Mitchell knew that if this relative was involved, they had kept their distance, waiting for the right moment to strike. Meanwhile, the autopsy report came back with more details. Maggie had been strangled, and the marks on her neck indicated that she had been caught off guard. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. This led Mitchell to believe that the killer was someone Maggie had known, someone she had trusted enough to let into her home without feeling threatened. With this new information, Mitchell started to focus on people from Maggie's current life. She began re-interviewing students, neighbors, and anyone else who had regular contact with Maggie. During these interviews, a pattern began to emerge. Several of Maggie's students mentioned that in recent months, Maggie had seemed distracted during lessons, often staring off into the distance or forgetting small details. This was unusual for Maggie, who had always been known for her sharp memory and attention to detail. Betty also confirmed that she had noticed a change in Maggie's behavior. She mentioned that Maggie had been receiving strange phone calls late at night, calls that she never talked about, but that left her visibly shaken afterward. When Betty asked Maggie about them, Maggie had brushed it off, saying it was nothing to worry about. But Betty had her doubts. Now, with Maggie gone, those phone calls seemed like an important clue. Mitchell requested Maggie's phone records and quickly discovered that the calls had been coming from a blocked number. The calls had started about 6 months before Maggie's death and had become more frequent in the weeks leading up to the murder. Mitchell was certain that whoever was behind those calls was connected to the crime, but without a way to trace the number, she was at a dead end. The case was growing more complicated by the day, and Mitchell knew she was running out of time. Whoever had killed Maggie had likely planned the crime carefully, and if she didn't find a solid lead soon, the trail would go cold. But Mitchell wasn't ready to give up. She knew that the answer was out there, hidden somewhere in Maggie's life, whether in her past or in her present. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Detective Sarah Mitchell found herself deep in the details of Maggie Reynolds' life, piecing together information from the neighbors, students, and the few records available from Maggie's past. The investigation had taken several unexpected turns, but she felt she was getting closer to understanding what led to the piano teacher's death. One of the first things Mitchell realized was that the strange phone calls Maggie had been receiving in the months leading up to her murder were key. The fact that the calls started 6 months prior, and then intensified, suggested that Maggie was being harassed or stalked by someone who wanted to make her life uncomfortable. This wasn't just a random crime, it had been planned, and whoever did this knew Maggie well enough to unsettle her before finally acting. Mitchell asked her team to look more deeply into the phone calls. Even though the number had been blocked, there were ways to trace its origins through the phone company. It would take time, but the detective was confident they could find a lead from there. In the meantime, she continued to dig into Maggie's past. The court case involving Maggie and her relative over her parents' estate still weighed on Mitchell's mind. That kind of legal battle often left deep wounds, and it wasn't hard to imagine someone harboring a grudge for years, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Mitchell found the name of the relative Harold Dawson, a distant cousin who had once lived in the same city as Maggie. After losing the case, Harold had moved to another part of the country, disappearing from public view. But records showed that Harold had struggled financially for years after the court battle, and Mitchell suspected that this might have fueled his anger even further. She decided to track Harold down. It wasn't easy. Harold had changed addresses several times, and there was little information available about his current life. But eventually she found him living in a small town about 100 miles away. Harold was now in his late 60s, a retired factory worker living alone. When Mitchell contacted him, Harold seemed cooperative. He admitted that he had been angry about the court case, but claimed that it was all in the past. He insisted that he hadn't spoken to Maggie in years and had no idea she had been murdered. Mitchell wasn't entirely convinced. Harold's demeanor was calm, but there was a tension in his voice that made her suspect he wasn't being entirely truthful. Still, without any concrete evidence linking him to the crime, she couldn't push too hard. Harold remained a person of interest, but there was nothing to tie him directly to Maggie's murder at this point. While the team waited for more information about the phone calls and continued to look into Harold Dawson, another lead emerged. During interviews with several of Maggie's former students, one name kept coming up: David Myers. David had been one of Maggie's students about 10 years earlier, but his lessons had ended abruptly. Maggie had never talked about why she stopped teaching David, and the other students had assumed he either lost interest or moved away. But some of them remembered David being a troubled boy. He had been quiet, withdrawn, and prone to outbursts of anger, especially when he couldn't play a piece perfectly. Maggie had been patient with him, but something had clearly gone wrong. Mitchell decided to look into David Myers, hoping that this might provide another clue. What she found was unsettling. David had been involved in several incidents over the years, ranging from petty crimes to more serious altercations. Most recently, he had been arrested for assault after getting into a fight with a coworker. There was clearly a pattern of violent behavior in David's life, and it seemed possible that he had some unresolved issues with Maggie. Mitchell tracked David down to his current address and brought him in for questioning. David was now in his mid-20s, but he still carried the same anger and resentment that had been mentioned by his former classmates. When asked about Maggie, David's demeanor changed. He claimed that she had been unfair to him, that she had pushed him too hard during lessons and made him feel like he was never good enough. But when Mitchell asked him about her murder, David denied having anything to do with it. He claimed that he hadn't seen or spoken to Maggie in years and that he had no reason to harm her. Despite David's denial, Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. His past behavior, combined with his bitterness toward Maggie, made him a strong suspect. But just like with Harold Dawson, there was no solid evidence linking him to the crime. Mitchell needed more to move forward. As the investigation continued, the pressure mounted. The town wanted answers, and Maggie's students and neighbors were growing impatient. Detective Mitchell was determined to find out who was behind Maggie's murder, but every lead seemed to end with more questions than answers. Weeks had passed since the murder, and Detective Mitchell was frustrated by the lack of progress. She had two strong suspects: Harold Dawson, the relative with a long-standing grudge, and David Myers, the former student with a history of violent behavior, but no concrete evidence tying either of them to the crime. And then finally a breakthrough came. The phone company had traced the block number that had been calling Maggie in the months leading up to her death. The calls had been coming from a disposable cell phone, which made it harder to track. But there was one critical piece of information: the phone had been purchased from a convenience store near David Myers' current residence. This was the first solid link between David and Maggie's murder. Mitchell immediately brought David in for questioning again. This time she didn't hold back. She confronted him with the evidence: the phone calls, his history of anger toward Maggie, and the fact that the phone had been purchased near his home. At first, David remained calm, denying everything. But as the pressure mounted, his story started to fall apart. Eventually, David broke. He admitted to making the phone calls, saying that he had been angry with Maggie for years and wanted to scare her. He claimed that he never intended to hurt her, that the calls were just a way to make her feel some of the pain he had felt during their lessons. But when Mitchell pushed him further, asking where he had been on the day of the murder, David became defensive. David's alibi was weak, and Mitchell could tell that he was hiding something. After hours of questioning, David finally confessed. On the day of the murder, he had gone to Maggie's house, intending to confront her face to face. He claimed that he just wanted to talk, but when Maggie opened the door and saw him, she became frightened and tried to close the door on him. In a moment of rage, David pushed his way inside. According to David, the confrontation quickly escalated. Maggie tried to calm him down, but David was too angry to listen. He yelled at her, accusing her of ruining his life, of making him feel worthless. When Maggie tried to walk away, David grabbed her by the neck in a fit of rage. He said he didn't realize how hard he was squeezing until it was too late. Maggie collapsed, and David panicked. He ran from the house, leaving her body slumped over the piano. David's confession was chilling, but it finally gave Mitchell the answer she had been searching for. Maggie's murder wasn't the result of a long-held grudge from a distant relative or some elaborate plot. It had been a crime of passion, driven by years of unresolved anger and resentment from a former student who couldn't let go of the past. With David's confession, the case was finally closed. The town, which had been on edge since Maggie's death, could finally begin to heal. But the tragedy of the situation remained. A beloved piano teacher had lost her life, not because of anything she had done wrong, but because of a young man's inability to cope with his own failures. As David was taken into custody, Mitchell reflected on the case. It was a stark reminder that the past has a way of catching up with people, and that unresolved anger can lead to devastating consequences. Maggie's life had been quiet, full of music and joy, but in the end, it had been shattered by a single moment of violence. The town would never forget the piano teacher's last lesson, and neither would Mitchell. With the case closed, Mitchell could finally move on to other work, but the memory of Maggie Reynolds and her tragic death would stay with her for a long time. The investigation had been long and difficult, but in the end, justice had been served. With David Meyer's confession, the case seemed to be wrapped up, but Detective Sarah Mitchell still had lingering thoughts about the events that led to Maggie Reynolds' death. The town could finally breathe a sigh of relief now that the mystery had been solved, but for those close to Maggie, the shock was far from over. The peaceful image of the beloved piano teacher was now forever stained by the tragic reality of her murder. As the investigation came to a close, the town had to face the painful truth that violence had emerged from within their own community. Maggie's murder had not been the work of an outsider or a stranger. It had come from someone she had once tried to help, someone she had once invited into her home to teach. David, who had struggled with anger and feelings of inadequacy for years, had finally let his frustration boil over, and in a moment of blind rage, he had taken her life. The trial that followed was straightforward, given David's confession. The courtroom was packed with members of the town, all eager to see justice served for Maggie. Emma Taylor and her father, Robert, sat quietly, still haunted by the memory of finding Maggie's body that fateful day. Betty Carter, Maggie's longtime neighbor, watched from the back of the courtroom, her heart heavy with grief. The community felt a deep sense of loss, and even though justice was being served, the wound left by Maggie's death would take a long time to heal. David's defense team tried to argue that his actions were the result of mental illness, pointing to his long history of emotional struggles and violent outbursts. They argued that he had not intended to kill Maggie, that it had been a momentary loss of control. But the prosecution, armed with David's own words, made it clear that his rage had been simmering for years. Maggie had become the target of his anger, not because of anything she had done, but because David had never been able to deal with his own failures. He had blamed her for his unhappiness, and, in a tragic moment, decided to act on that anger. The jury took only a few hours to reach their verdict. David was found guilty of second-degree murder, acknowledging that while the crime had not been premeditated, it was intentional. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. For many in the town, the sentence brought a sense of closure, but the pain of losing Maggie in such a senseless way lingered. In the weeks that followed the trial, the town tried to move on, but Maggie's absence was felt deeply by everyone who knew her. The piano lessons stopped, and her house, once filled with the sound of music, remained silent. The children who had learned from her missed her gentle guidance, and her students, past and present, came together to hold a small memorial in her honor. They placed flowers outside her home and shared memories of the kind woman who had taught them more than just music. For many, Maggie had been more than a teacher. She had been a mentor and a friend. Detective Mitchell, too, found it hard to move on from the case. Despite solving the crime, there was a sense of sadness that she couldn't shake. She had seen many cases over the years, but this one hit differently. Maggie had lived a quiet life, filled with kindness, and yet her life had been taken by someone she had once tried to help. It was a harsh reminder of how easily darkness can creep into even the most peaceful lives. Mitchell visited Maggie's grave a few weeks after the trial, standing quietly as she reflected on the case. It wasn't often that she found herself this affected by her work, but something about Maggie's life and death had stayed with her. She thought about the young man who had let his anger consume him, about the missed opportunities for him to get the help he so desperately needed. But more than anything, she thought about Maggie, the woman who had spent her life teaching others and whose own life had been cut short in such a tragic way. As time went on, the town slowly returned to its normal rhythm. New piano teachers moved in, children went back to school, and life continued. But for those who knew Maggie, the memory of her life and her tragic death remained. The case was closed, but the story of the piano teacher and her last lesson was one that no one in the town would forget.